What's going on, Summoners? Welcome back to another episode of ProGuides Best Champions to Main, now on patch 11.10. The champs that we pick for this series are strong picks with high performance, but also have low ban rates and are unlikely to be nerfed anytime soon. So they're reliable picks for climbing and are definitely worth investing your time into. We also have a series that covers the most broken and contested picks in each role, so make sure you're subbed to the channel so you don't miss out when we post those as well. With that being said, let's hop into the video. Kicking things off in the top lane, we'll start off with Ornn. Ornn has been largely overshadowed by other tanks for the past few months, but he's floated his way back up into the upper tiers in the current meta. One really nice thing about Ornn over the other beefy boys in top lane is that he doesn't have a weak early game that makes it easy to push around champions like Malphite and MAOKAI for the first few levels. In fact, with the constant poke from his Q and potential for those hard-hitting combos on opponents that stay too close to his pillar, Ornn is able to aggressively trade and even bully in many matchups. And with the ability to craft items in lane, you don't have to go back to hit your power spikes. This item advantage means that your opponent is pretty much forced to go back to base to match your purchases, and most of the time, they'll have to teleport back to avoid missing too much XP and to try to prevent you from taking turret plates. If you can force them to use their summoner, you're forcing a TP advantage, so you have a guaranteed numbers advantage when it comes time to turn a fight bot lane or force a dragon fight. Outside of lane phase, Ornn may lack the instant go button that other tanks have, but the longer setup time on his ultimate is a small price to pay for the impact that it can have on a fight. If you can take a fight in a tight pathway in the jungle, the slow and knock-up can absolutely devastate the entire enemy team. While you usually want to be the one starting fights, it can also be a great counter-engage tool too, forcing the enemy team to scatter, delaying their follow-up on the other enemies that are diving onto your backline. And our second top laner is Cho'Gath. Similar to Ornn, he's extremely lane dominant, even in the first few levels thanks to the trading power from his E. In fact, even when you're not directly fighting your opponent, the ranged cleaving damage from E's spikes can help you slowly poke your opponents down. That, alongside with the sustain from Cho's passive, allows you to slowly but surely build up an HP lead over your opponents and eventually push them out of lane. With all of that laning strength backing you up, you'll want to throw your weight around as much as you can. Constantly move up to auto trade on your opponents when they try to move up for CS. If they're playing a bit more respectively, or you're just dealing with a ranged opponent, you'll have to try and land a Q instead. Due to the delay on the cast, Cho'Gath's Q is one of the harder CC abilities to land as a tank. But don't worry, just look to cast it when they move up to last hit a minion. Just keep fishing like this, and eventually you'll land a hit, with a knock-up and slow giving you enough time to close the gap and get in an auto or two. Once you have ultimate, you want to use this every time it's up on minions. It can be tempting to hold the cooldown in case you have a chance to last hit a champion, but you really want to beef up as fast as possible. The only time I'd recommend holding it for a kill on a champ is when your jungler is for sure pathing to your lane soon. And for our last top laner, we have Nocturne. Usually when picking between tanks and bruisers, you're choosing between the consistent teamfight results from the tanks or the higher risk, higher reward carry potential that comes with a bruiser. Even if you lose lane as a tank, you have enough CC to engage fights, and even when down in items, you'll still be tanky enough to provide at least a couple seconds of disruption in 5v5s. Bruisers need to do well early so that later in the game, they can either win as a duelist in a side lane, or just have the ability to dive into a teamfight and pose a threat without being instantly blown up. But with Nocturne, you kinda get the best of both worlds. You have a bruiser that has essentially an unbeatable laning phase. He can outduel most, if not all, other champions in the lane, with a Dusk Trail from his Q basically giving him a zone where no one can contest him in a 1v1. By the time the trail dissipates, you will have already cleared the wave and have the freedom to back off or even go for a roam. And if an opponent is foolish enough to try and contest you, the combination of being able to spell shield one of their crucial abilities and having a fear allows you to easily take them down. Once you're level 6, you can force fights on your lane opponent, but a better use is usually to roam down and gank the enemy mid laner. You can even recall and use it to help out your bot laners as long as you have your TP after to return to your own lane. Nocturne has traditionally been played as an assassin, basically building full damage to one-shot opponents that you catch in rotation. Now, while that playstyle is still viable in the jungle and mid lane, top lane assassins are usually outscaled pretty fast. Tanks and bruisers will easily be able to take you on in 1v1 situations mid to late game. So the tankier bruiser build that we give here is much more flexible. Instead of being limited to looking for picks before fights, you can actually dive right into 5v5s, even engaging fights for your team, so you aren't totally shut down by the enemy team grouping up. Next up, taking things into the jungle, we'll start off with one of the most degenerate champs, KARTHUS. While most of the meta picks are champs that can provide early game pressure, many of those picks need to do well early to win games, falling off hard if they can't snowball. But instead, Karthus' farm-heavy playstyle makes him a consistent carry that has the damage to wipe out the entire enemy team if you can scale up. To get to that point, you'll want to play the early game with a bit of caution. Aim to full clear your jungle and avoid fighting over scuttle crabs when you know the enemy jungler will be there. The only time you should ever look to contest is when you're absolutely sure that your laners will have priority and that they're willing to rotate to help. It's way too common in solo queue to see junglers just assume that their laners are on the same page, so make sure you're pinging and watching the minimap. While KARTHUS may not exactly be the best early game ganker, don't pass up a free kill on a super extended opponent. Your W's wall can actually make ganks pretty free, especially if it's on a flashless opponent. Lastly, when you can't force a gank to happen directly, just keep an eye on the minimap. Sometimes your teammates may forget that they have a KARTHUS on their team, so it's up to you to recognize when a fight is happening where your ult may turn the tables. Finish off an opponent that's just barely escaping, or even just steal a kill for your greedy self. I mean stack Dark Harvest, clearly. Once you make it to the team fights, KARTHUS is pretty easy to execute. Basically, just don't be a KDA player. In fact, you actually want to die, so you can make the most of your last stand rune in your passive. Your main goal is to die in the middle of the enemy team, doing as much damage with your Qs and E as you can. Just don't forget to ult before you get locked out of the cast. KARTHUS is such a strong pick that he's actually one of the few champs that we consider a strong, reliable pick into Morgana and Rumble right now. Two champions that absolutely stomp almost every other pick in the current jungle meta. But of course, that's always assuming that you know how to path perfectly for maximum farm and minimize the risk of dying. Falling just a bit behind usually means that you'll have little to no impact against these OP picks. So if you're not entirely confident in your jungle skills, we also got you covered. Check out ProGuides.com and one of our top tier coaches to help you optimize your pathing, teach you when and how to properly gank, and every other skill that you need to get consistent results when you're playing a pick like KARTHUS. Especially with the changes coming on 11.10, jungle pathing is gonna be all over the place. So if you wanna make sure you're on the top of the meta, talk to our coaches, they will help you out. Moving on to our next jungler though, we got Kindred. If you like the idea of playing a marksman, but not the part where your entire game is dictated by your support, then they may be for you. To make Kindred work, the first thing you have to learn is that their passive is key. Even if you can get really fed in the early game, not having any stacks means that you'll lack the range to kite opponents and carry teamfights later on. On top of the crucial range increases, stacks also enhance each of your abilities. So with their passive in mind, you'll have to think about your path right away from the start of the game. Almost all Kindred players just mark the enemy jungler since that's statistically the most common enemy that you'll run into on the map. But I find that it's actually pretty easy to get a stack off the enemy top laner, so I usually start off my games by marking them. In most games, by the time you clear your second buff to get to level 3, the top wave will be in the middle of the lane. If it's in that state, the lane is pretty gankable depending on your top laner, but bonus points if you tell your laner that you plan on coming early and that they should let their opponent push a bit. Aside from playing for passive stacks, another thing that distinguishes a good Kindred from an average one is when you use your E. When you're just going in for a gank, it's understandable to use it right away for the slow, but when you're dueling somebody, make sure to use it later in the fight to make the most out of the execute damage. And our last jungler on the list is Zac. Most true tanks in the jungle aren't in a great spot in the current meta. Their farm-heavy, scale for teamfight playstyle means that they have very little influence on the early stages of most games, especially since they usually have to fight around long ult cooldowns. By the time they actually come online, the other jungler has completely snowballed the game by putting themselves and their laners too far ahead. But Zac is a little different. He's able to pull through thanks to his ability to influence the game much faster than his other beefy peers. That's because Zac isn't hard gated by a long ult cooldown to be useful. In fact, Zac's ult is almost more of an afterthought. All of Zac's ganking strength comes from his E. Once you have that maxed out at level 9, the ability to come flying over any wall from any angle gives you ability to pressure every lane, netting kills on opponents that move even a hair too far from their turret. On top of his early game presence, Zac also has a massive disruption potential in teamfights. Not only does he provide constant hard and soft CC in the backline, he does a lot of damage over time. If you're snowballing hard early, you can even pick up a Demonic Embrace as your second or third item to push that damage up a notch and be an even more dangerous threat to the enemy carries. Now moving on to the mid laners, we'll start off with GALIO. Let me start off by saying this, yes, I know GALIO was nerfed this patch. Despite that, he's still one of the best mid laners in the game and can solve all of your problems if you constantly struggle with laning against assassins. In fact, GALIO is the perfect champ for taking the skill out of a hard skill matchup and completely neutralizing just about any opponent. His strong wave clear and ability to skirmish make him every jungler's best friend. So no longer will you be spam pinged and flamed because your jungler took a bad fight for a scuttle crab, at least hopefully. And it's not just your jungler. Once you level 6, your ability to roam means that you can also go help your side lanes pretty much anytime it's up. Outside of lane phase, you want to recognize that GALIO is more of a reactive champ than an initiator. He does best when he can use his ult to either follow up on an ally's engage or as a defensive tool when the enemy team has divers reaching his backline, with his ultimate's huge radius preventing other enemies from following up. Ult aside, you can also just be a beefy frontliner that lives to peel for your carries. The huge area coverage of your taunt makes it nearly impossible for divers to get past you and onto your backline, so just try to be conscious of where you need to stand and keep your carry safe. I miss him as a support, but our second mid laner today is Pantheon. While their kits might not be similar in the slightest, he's kinda like an AD form of Galio. He's great at controlling the pace of lane with his strong wave clear, he's a super strong early game skirmisher to help your jungler win early river fights, and once you're level 6, he has the ability to roam and make things happen in side lanes with his ultimate. But unlike Galio, you're not playing for your team. You'll be playing Pantheon with the more selfish goal of getting yourself as fed as possible so that you can carry the game yourself. In the lane phase, you'll look to trade as often as you can, constantly scrapping to poke out your opponents. Alternatively, if your opponent is trying too hard to shove in the wave, you can actually play a bit passive and call your jungler to the lane. With your point and click CC and high burst damage, it's pretty much a guaranteed kill. Once you have a lead and you can get out of lane phase, you want to avoid direct 5v5s as much as you can. To do this, stick to side laning and looking for picks instead, or rotating to fights ahead of your opponent and using your ult to force a fight with a numbers advantage. Even though you'll be building pretty damage heavy, your ease block will enable you to absorb a lot of damage while your team then follows up. And our last mid laner is Annie. If you're looking for a champion that you can play on autopilot, she's probably the best for you. Starting off with her laning phase, it kind of feels like Annie comes with a pair of training wheels. Her Q is point and click, has a low cooldown, and refunds all of the mana and half of its cooldown when you use it to last hit. So with just a little bit of practice, you'll be able to hit perfect CS in no time. But in the event that you need to push a bit faster, you can also use W to soften up the wave before using Q to finish off each minion. And once your passive stun is up, you can use that to zone out your opponents. But don't get so wrapped up in hitting the stun that you stop using your spells to farm. Most laners will over-respect your kill potential on them and sit really far back, so a better use of your kit is to just look for roams. Anytime after level 6, you should be able to make kills happen bot lane. If the enemy laners are overextended for even a second, ganking is pretty easy. Even if they're being pushed in, you can also go for a dive. Usually diving can be somewhat risky, but with Annie's kit being as easy as it is, a flash combo is pretty much foolproof and should almost always result in a free kill or two. And the best part is that even with such a strong early game, Annie never really reaches a fall-off point. The balancing factor is that she's relatively short range for a mage, but as long as you have flash up, you can always make a game-winning one-shot onto a high-priority carry on the enemy team. Just be sure to ult chat outplayed when you do. You also gotta win the mental battle. Now moving things down to the bot lane, our first pick is one that's very popular at MSI right now, Varus. What Varus brings to the table is being an incredibly strong lane bully, without a single losing matchup against any other AD carry, and also the ability to provide some engage with his ult. While his ult might not have the global range of an Ashe arrow, it can be way more useful when in a choke point, especially when layered with other AoE CC, where it gets a chance to root multiple opponents. During lane phase, you'll want to trade often, using your Hail of Blades to quickly apply 3 stacks of Blight before popping the stacks with your Q or E. When you're laning with an aggressive engage support like Leona or Nautilus, you have kill pressure the second that you hit level 6. While it's generally up to your support to dictate how the lane is played, don't be afraid to shoot an ult if you see the chance. As long as your support doesn't have grandma reaction speeds, you should be able to easily pick up a kill with both of your full combos. And since this is a lethality build, outside of lane phase, you'll be aiming to poke with your Q a lot before teamfights happen. Hail of Blades will give you a pretty good burst damage up front on opponents that get close enough, but you don't have the DPS of on hit or crit Varus in straight up fights. On the topic of builds, this one is the more generally used since it gives better early game dominance and a faster mid game power spike. It pairs well with both kill lane supports and lane bullies like Zyra or Karma, but if you're laning with a scaling enchanter like Lulu or Seraphine and your team has a really strong 5v5 going for it, you can also consider swapping for lethal tempo. Up next, we have an AD carry that I think is criminally underrated right now, KOG'MAW. When you're ready to pump out as much damage as possible, he's definitely a good pick for you. I would like to note that KOG'MAW is the definition of an immobile hyper carry. You got no dash, no speed up, and no stealth or really anything of the sort to help you escape from danger. Your sole defensive tool is the slight slow from your E. So with that in mind, you should at least be decent at orb walking before you decide to main this champ, so that you can kill the enemy before they kill you. But with that preamble out of the way, let's talk about his laning phase. Despite being a hyper carry, KOG'MAW isn't actually that bad of a laner. In fact, when you fight around his W cooldown, you can actually win most 2v2s as long as you aren't dealing with a major support gap. So with that in mind, you want to give thought to when you should actually be using your W in lane. You may get away with using it to harass a less aggressive lane with an enchanter support, but when dealing with aggressive lanes with the potential to engage on you, you always want to save your W so that you can fight back when they look to engage. Outside of lane, positioning is everything. You need to think about the enemy team, where you should stand to avoid their engage, and what other threats you may have to deal with in fights. If they have an assassin, always be near somebody who can peel you. Also, always stick to front to back style fighting and never flash forward unless it's a 100% to win a team fight. And real quick, there's one more thing I gotta say about our build choice. The build that we gave helps keep your W up as often as possible for optimal damage against standard teams. But when you're dealing with a tankier team comp, you wanna swap up your build. For your runes, you'll trade out Coup de Grace for Cut Down. And item-wise, you're gonna go Gwinsu's After Boots, then Hurricane, followed up by Lord Dominic's Regards. Now, every KOG'MAW's favorite support is Lulu. Out of all the enchanters, she has some of the best laning strike that help him make it to late game, and once they're there, she also buffs him up like no one else can. So that brings us to today's question of the day. What is your favorite bot lane duo? I don't know why this happened to me, but I constantly duo with Jhin mains, so I spent a lot of time theorizing the best support to pair with him. Now in Season 10, I would have said Pantheon Jhin was my favorite bot lane duo ever, but since the Pantheon support nerfs, it doesn't really work as well anymore. So instead, I love playing Brand Jhin. The amount of burst damage that you have is absolutely insane, and both of your W's paired on top of each other pretty much guarantee a kill. But let me know your answers in the comments down below. Now our last bot lane pick is actually a support pick, Seraphine. While she's fallen off pretty hard in terms of popularity, Seraphine is still an incredibly strong pick when you prefer to scale up to the teamfight stage of the game. But even with that strong scaling, she's not a total pushover in lane. In fact, being a mage with strong AoE damage means that you can usually get priority over most other bot lanes and be the first one to rotate when your jungler needs you to make a play for Scuttle Crab, Dragon, or an invade. And while she may lack the damage that most other mages have, she makes up for it with her CC combo in early fights. You may not quite have the damage to nuke opponents down from 100 to 0 on your own, but you can definitely help spoon feed an ally, so don't be afraid to call your jungler down to get them nice and fed. Even though you're basically building like a support, you'll still want to continue taking farm as much as you can to reach those spikes faster. The more gold you have, the more you're buffing up your carries after all. So continue wave clearing when you can, but don't ever look to fight in a side lane. Your entire goal is to group up and win 5v5 fights for objectives. Now to round out our list, we'll start off our supports with Soraka. While Soraka's heal-heavy identity may make her seem like a combat medic with the sole purpose of keeping allies alive to turn fights, you have to realize that there's a lot more to her than just spamming W and ulting at the right time. Hitting Soraka's Q isn't just an option, it is a crucial part of her kit. In lane, if you just sit back and heal your carries as they 1v2, the result is you running out of HP as you try to restore theirs. Instead, you should be moving up and taking an aggressive stance with Q. Not only are you actually being useful in the 2v2 by dealing damage to your opponents, but each time you land it, the health cost of your W is massively reduced. So unless you're super desperate, you should really never use your W on an ally without your Q's rejuvenation buff on you. Outside of laning, you'll play teamfights with a similar mindset. Try to land a Q before healing an ally. Now, while Soraka's E used to be a hard-hitting, spammable ability to the point that the title Battle Rocka was coined, that's kind of a thing of the past now, and you max this last. But don't let that fool you into thinking it doesn't have huge potential in teamfights. You'll want to use it to shut down opponents at pivotal times. For example, holding it to stop a Katarina right as she ults, or using it on top of an enemy in stasis to prevent them from doing anything when they get out. And our second support is MAOKAI, this time with a Comet page setup. Comet will give you a much harder hitting poke, with the slow from your saplings ensuring that it hits on any target without a dash. What makes MAOKAI so nice is his flexibility as a support. You can spam saplings for hard hitting poke and brush control, and go for all-ins when you're confident that you and your carry can finish off your target. When you're ready to force the kill, wait for your target to get close to a brush with a sapling in it. Flash W then, and use Q to knock them towards the sapling. Alternatively, you can also play MAOKAI more defensively, still spamming saplings to control the lane, but never actually going in with your W. Instead, position between the opposing support and your AD carry, and use your Q to disengage them if they ever try to go in. This is going to be the playstyle that you go for when you're laning with passive carries that lack tools to jump into the fight. Outside of the lane, you'll still want to spam saplings on cooldown for two reasons. One, they kind of work like budget wards, giving a bit of info on where enemies are. Two, they act like landmines, chunking out opponents that face check them in brushes. Just one of these saplings can deal a pretty decent amount of damage, but when you consider that you're constantly spamming them in every brush on the map, an opponent could potentially die before they actually make it to where they're trying to go. And since they do damage based on your opponent's max HP, not even tanks can play the role of Minesweeper to clear the way and get away unscathed. And finishing off our list, we have one of my favorite champions in the game, ZILEAN. When you're picking ZILEAN, your goal is simply to enable your team to carry as hard as possible, and erase any of their mistakes that you can. All of that ally enabling power means that ZILEAN has insane scaling, but it comes at the cost of being extremely team reliant in the early game. It's very rare that you'll ever run into a winning 2v2 lane, unless you end up with a super high damage AD carry like Draven against a very low threat lane like Ezreal with an enchanter. So unless you do get a free pass in the lane phase, you'll want to play as defensive as you can until your jungler comes to gank. Once help does arrive though, make sure that you lead with your slow before attempting to land a double bomb for a guaranteed stun. Out of the lane phase, you'll enable divers and frontliners with movement speed to start fights and give your carries the buff to help kite away from danger. Or in some cases, use it on an opponent to slow them to the point that they may as well be stunned. Just like in lane, you don't want to randomly spam your double bombs in teamfights. Instead, wait for a point where an opponent is either already CC'd by your ally, or an enemy diver is jumping onto one of your carries, a situation where the enemy won't be able to dodge the second bomb. Another good window to abuse for double bombing is when an opponent is in stasis or is in the process of reviving. The second they come out of stasis or revive, both bombs will simultaneously attach, instantly stunning them. Lastly, ZILEAN is pretty self-explanatory, so there's not a lot to say about this. You'll want to use it more on your useful teammates and never yourself, so position yourself so that you're the least likely teammate to be jumped on by an enemy. That said, sometimes you just can't help it if the enemy team has an assassin like Zed or Talon and they got your number. So in those cases, make sure to buy a Zhonya's so that you can save that ult for an ally. And that was the best champions domain for patch 11.10. Remember to let us know your favorite bot lane duo in the comments down below. And also, don't forget to check out our Discord in the description box below, where you can discuss League further or just hang out and be part of our community. That's it for the video today, so best of luck on the Rift, everybody. Stay hydrated, and I'll see you next time.